Hey there, it's Silver. This is Tainted Grail, The Fall of Avalon. So I figured now would be a good time to actually take a look at this game finally, because they just put out their 0.7 update, which is huge. It's actually the biggest update they've ever made for the game all at once. It adds like an entirely new world space to explore with new dungeons and new side quests and stuff. There's currently no major story progression through it, but that will come later, as the main thing right now was to just get the whole new area in the game. So here it all is. So what is Tainted Grail? Well, Tainted Grail is actually a board game, believe it or not. It started its life as a very successful, I want to say 2018 Kickstarter that created this really well thought out and interesting board game that has some like card game elements and a bunch of other stuff to it. It looks like a lot of fun to play. I think it can even be played single player, which is a rarity for games like that. But I mentioned it was a well thought out setting, and that's because there was a ton of background lore and stuff that was written for it, and it's a fully realized setting with a lot of really interesting ideas. So of course there are also video games taking place in that setting. And the idea is more or less, at least as I understand it, Tainted Grail is a very dark fantasy retelling of Arthurian legend, sort of a corruption of King Arthur's story in a lot of ways. And I'm always a fan of that kind of thing. I think there's honestly a lot of mileage in taking Arthurian myth and making it into something else. So the background is there was this island called Avalon, and this island had this strange sort of magic mist covering it that's called the Weirdness, W-Y-R-D, and it's sort of a mysterious magical force that warps reality, more or less. And there were these disturbing beings called the Four-Dwellers that lived on Avalon, and they were sort of in symbiosis with the Weirdness, it seems, and could use it to sort of make whatever they imagine real. But in the homelands, which are not, as far as I'm aware, described in detail, in the homelands where King Arthur is from, there was a plague called the Red Death that was sort of sweeping the area and killing everyone, so he took a whole bunch of faithful knights and left to establish a human kingdom elsewhere away from the plague, and found Avalon. He then proceeded to conquer the place, get rid of the Four-Dwellers, become something mysterious and different from just a normal human, but no one knows exactly what happened to him, and then establish a human kingdom here on Avalon. And this game takes place about 600 years after all of that happened. So you could say really that this game has two different stories that are taking place simultaneously. There's one, the story of your character, the character that you will create. There is character creation in this game, and what you're doing in the modern day Avalon to sort of help fix all the problems, because the weirdness is coming back and some other mysterious events are happening, and you gotta try and figure out how to keep these sort of barely holding on human kingdoms alive. But in addition to the more modern day quests that your character is going on, there's also the mystery of what happened to King Arthur those 600 years ago. What did he become? What exactly were the Four-Dwellers? And how is all this relevant to the current predicament on modern day Avalon? So you're sort of trying to solve the modern day problems while also trying to figure out these mysteries from the past to see if they hold the answers. So as a first-person RPG, there's a lot of dungeon crawling and there are open world elements, although it's not a single contiguous open world. Every act or chapter of the game takes place in its own open world. So rather than one big map, you get multiple smaller maps, which I actually like the design of so far because that allows them to be more focused, have less repeated content and more unique stuff without a bunch of empty space to pad them out. The game uses a very Elder Scrolls-like skill system, where you have skills that govern everything from your armor skills to your weapon skills and your magic and all that stuff, and you improve them simply by using them. So, if you cast a bunch of magic, your magic skill will go up. If you get hit while wearing medium armor, then your medium armor skill will go up, things like that. But you also have sort of governing overall skills like strength and dexterity and all those things, and you can up those by leveling. So you gain experience in this world mostly by just doing anything. Every time one of your smaller skills will go up just by using it, you'll gain some experience. Whenever you complete quests, you'll gain experience. When you kill enemies, you'll gain it. Crafting items. So just about everything you can do will gain you XP. And when you level up, you'll get some points to spend on a number of skill trees. There's one skill tree for each of the main stats, so like a strength skill tree and a perception skill tree and stuff like that. And there's also, of course, the stat points to increase those stats directly. So you do have a lot of control over how your character is built. And that makes this game's overall gameplay kind of like a first-person Souls-like in a way. It's not a Souls-like really. You don't lose things when you die or anything like that, but it does have that idea mixture of lots of equipment and build variety with a lot of granular control over what your stats are. So there's a lot of just build yourself however you want, and you'll end up with a pretty good character usually. I haven't noticed any major flaws in terms of how the game's building works. Like, I haven't noticed anything that's like drastically weaker than something else to the point that it's not worth using or anything like that so far. You will be plopped down into the first act's open world area pretty soon. You can do an optional prologue, which I do recommend if you haven't played the game yet, just because it sort of teaches you the controls and how generally everything works. And it's also just kind of a fun little bit of exploration with some optional paths and some crafting you can try and some lockpicking, and just sort of generally a good tutorial, I feel. But once you're done with that, you'll end up in the first act, and you'll notice the way that this game's structure works. Basically, you'll have a small open world area with a bunch of optional stuff, places of interest, camps, caves, dungeons, things like that around the place. And then, of course, you'll have a bunch of side quests that you can do, usually some sort of central hub town with merchants and side quests and all that good stuff. And then you'll have a main story progression that will take you through more major dungeons, some of which will be locked or only partially accessible until you get the relevant story quest. So I've noticed that a lot of the more minor dungeons you can go to and do in any order you want, and many of them are optional, but the main story dungeons are usually either locked or you can only get partway through them before you get some sort of key item in the story later that allows you to explore the bulk of it. Combat is what you're going to be doing most of the time, given that it's an action RPG, and the combat in this game is pretty solid. You've got a good variety of weapons and magic to use, and they have a pretty good amount of impact. A lot of that impact, I feel, is carried by the sound design. The animations in this game are pretty solid, but nothing to like write home about. You know, there's nothing about the animations that's incredibly satisfying or anything like that. They do their job and that's fine, but the sound design, I think, is where it shines a little bit. The impacts of weapons feel better because of the sound. Magic is also just that little extra bit more satisfying to use because of the very glowy effects and nice sound that accompanies casting spells. It is also a bit of an Elder Scrolls-like combat system, you could say, because you've got your usual setup of like a one-handed weapon and shield, a one-handed weapon and spell, or a two-handed weapon, and you can sort of just switch whatever you want depending on what you want to be equipped with. You've got your series of light attacks as well as a chargeable heavy attack. And you've also got stuff like parries, the ability to block with just about any weapon, and if you block with just the right time, you can parry enemies, which tends to stagger them and open them up for really good heavy counterattacks and stuff. So that's always a good system to have when it works pretty well, and I think overall the timing for the parries is pretty easy to understand. It seems to work pretty well. Although I will say one problem that the melee combat in this game does have sometimes is that enemy hitboxes seem to extend quite far ahead of where the physical weapon swings. You'll be standing well ahead of an enemy and you can see the entire weapon as it swings through the air. It's in front of you, it's not actually touching you, and it'll still hit you. So sometimes I think the enemy melee hitboxes might need to be shored up a little bit because a lot of them seem to extend quite far ahead of where the enemy actually should theoretically be hitting. You've also got a dash, which is really important. Stamina conservation is pretty important in this game's combat system. Your swings and power swings and stuff will of course take stamina, and your dash takes quite a bit of it as well. So you don't want to drain your entire stamina gauge by laying into an enemy and then not have enough left to dash away for the counterattack that's inevitably going to come right at your face. So you do need to take care of your stamina gauge. And there is also a light, medium, and heavy armor system in this game, as well as equipment encumbrance. You have two different levels of encumbrance. You have your overall inventory weight, which is just how much stuff you can carry in general, and then you have your equipment weight, which is how much stuff you can actually have on your body at once. Higher equipment encumbrance will reduce your dash distance, so it'll make you a bit less mobile. It'll also reduce the MP regeneration you have and make spells cost more. So if you want to use magic, you're kind of limited to like light armor or maybe a little bit of medium armor here and there, because otherwise it will just slow down your mana regeneration too much to really be viable. I definitely like the combat in this game overall. I think despite these somewhat dissonant hitboxes occasionally, the overall gameplay loop of bashing things, bonking skeletons, and firing crazy spells from the other hand is a lot of fun. And it's the equipment variety that really does it. There's a lot of weapons with really cool weapon models, a lot of spells with fun effects. There's just a lot of variety in terms of what you can use, and that really helps the first-person combat feel enjoyable. In terms of how the game looks, I think there's something to be said. It's obviously not like AAA quality, super high texture resolution and stuff like that, but it's clearly not trying to be. That kind of thing is highly expensive to make, and I think that games that have this more AA appearance are really endearing, and I like the way that they look. The LODs in this game are interesting to me, the way that objects fade over distance to help rendering. They look kind of like Bethesda LODs, like Oblivion and a little bit of Skyrim. And I actually mean that in a good way because I have a lot of nostalgia for how LODs used to work in games like that. They were a little bit more obvious, a little bit more like limited in terms of how they rendered the world at a distance. And I think that style looks kind of cool. And I think that it also fits with the overall art design of this game to have those somewhat more limited distance models because everything is kind of dark and muddy. And when things are bright and colorful, it's almost harsh. Like it's so bright, kind of like how Oblivion could get sometimes, where everything looked a little bit harsh and sun-bleached, and I think that's on purpose. But by far my favorite aspects of how the game looks and sounds are all the Four Dwellers stuff. So the Four Dwellers were really disturbing, it turns out, and a lot of their stuff is really creepy. Going through Four Dweller ruins, you get the impression that the walls and pillars and stuff that make up the place weren't exactly built as much as they were maybe grown. They all have this really disturbing, kind of visceral appearance. Their murals are skeletal and creepy with too many arms. The music that you have while exploring Four Dweller areas is usually just reduced to creepy ambience and a lot of like kind of yawning cavernous noises that make the whole place just feel extra unsettling. And the overall art design of anything Four Dweller related is top-notch. It is easily the most beautiful and disturbing part of the game's art design. Everything related to their stuff looks super cool. They're clearly, the influences that make up the sort of art design of the Four Dweller stuff is pretty obvious. Like, it's kind of like a combination of Lovecraftian elements with like Beksinski-esque art, and it looks awesome. You've got that sort of biomechanical or otherwise organic nature to a lot of stuff that you're seeing, but in a sort of dead and disturbing way rather than like a living, pulsing, fleshy way. You'll see things like the design of the menhirs, which are these big skeletal statues with too many arms, and even just the ambient sounds that happen around them are like really disturbing whispers and screams and stuff that you can't tell exactly what they're all supposed to be. It's like this cacophony of weird, chaotic noises. And you'll also notice that in the more underground Four Dweller areas, you'll see some other crazy stuff that's like a mix of really advanced magical technology and really unknown, creepy, organic stuff. So you'll see in the same chamber this big, huge, like energy generator looking thing that looks almost sci-fi and advanced. But it's being powered by these huge, like Dark Souls 2-esque, faceless giants just turning this big stone wheel around. And then you'll also notice that the Lovecraftian elements really come to the fore in certain points, like when you meet the Lord of the Sea, for instance, which I'm not going to show because that would be like a huge visual spoiler and I would rather people see that for themselves. But it is a really cool moment when you wake up in the Lord of the Sea's domain and see him for the first time. He's actually so huge and strangely designed to the point that when you first look at him, you actually can't tell what you're looking at and don't know if it's something that's living or if it's like architecture. So when this game goes down towards the Four Dweller or other related like Lovecraftian and Beksinski inspired aspects, the art design goes ham and everything looks really cool and interesting. And I think that the game's best moments are those dungeon crawling moments and big reveal moments where you're in those kinds of places and you're seeing the art design chops of the team working on this game going at like full blast. Back in the normal open world areas, you will find a lot of quests to do, both of the main story and side varieties. And the side quest design, I think, is pretty good for the most part. You do have your usual go here and kill things, and go here, grab thing and bring it to me kind of quests, but you've also got some more interesting stuff to find, some little puzzles to solve in the environment, and some secret areas to come across and things of that nature. I think the game is overall really good at rewarding you for exploration. Because the open worlds are somewhat small but packed with stuff to find, this means that they're able to reward you frequently for going off the beaten path and just finding stuff, because there's not a whole lot of empty, pointless space. Pretty much everything has a reason to be there. There is one criticism I have of the quest design though, and that's that a lot of the side quests right now are broken. You can't complete them. You can get like 3/4 of the way through them, but then there won't be a dialogue option to actually sort of turn in whatever you need to turn in to finally complete the quest at the end. So they're stuck in your journal and you can't complete them right now. And that's of course understandable for an early access game. That's going to happen, but it is kind of weird to me that they would go through the process of adding an entirely new world space with like hours of new quests and still have a bunch of broken ones in the first world space that you go to that haven't been fixed yet. I also think that the variety is in kind of an interesting place because the variety in the first open world area is pretty good, but it's given to you in slow bursts as you explore through the various dungeons and things. However, once you get to the new world space, you'll find tons of new spells and weapons and stuff that you've never seen before, all like sort of grouped together within small areas. So it's like the amount of equipment and spell variety in the first area is just sort of a shadow of what happens in the second area, but the second area is sort of throws it all on you at once in really quick succession. So I think that once this area is more developed with more of a, just more side quests in general, as well as all the story quests and stuff, this will probably change and you'll have a more normal progression to go through and find all of this new variety and content and stuff, because right now it's all fresh and new, so it's all kind of jumbled together, but I have a feeling that'll change later. But what is available in the new world space is very cool. It's super cool looking. It's got some neat vistas and some mysterious things that I'd like to know more about, as well as some setups for what looks like are going to be some kind of hard choices and some really cool story moments once all that's added in. I'm also a big fan of the direction they're going in with the way the new weapon models look and the way the new spells work. I think that if what they're continuing to add to the game is going to match that kind of quality and interesting design, then this game is going to have some really cool stuff come into game when it comes to just overall variety and how you can build your character. Overall, I think Tainted Grail is shaping up so far to be a really solid dark fantasy action RPG with a good focus on variety and some stellar art design, some pretty solid music and sound design overall, and some very cool and interesting story elements with the sorts of things that you encounter and the sorts of places you go. Some of the more dreamlike sequences and boss fights are also really crazy, but I'm obviously not going to show that kind of stuff in this video because it's all very visual spoilery, and that kind of thing I feel is better experienced on your own. I wouldn't want to ruin it for everyone. But as the game has currently been developed, it's got a pretty brisk update pace for some really large updates so far, and it's clear that the team is passionate about finishing this game and making it the best that it can be, so I have no qualms about recommending it in its current state, and I have a feeling that the finished product will be coming rather soon and will be really quite a good and rare example of a sort of indie first-person RPG like this. So I'll put the link in the description below this video to the Steam store page for Tainted Grail if you wish to check it out yourselves. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.